Content warning: this story discusses betrayal, financial exploitation, imprisonment, and suicide without graphic detail. If these topics are difficult for you, please take care as you read. They called me aside at the airport because of a photograph. I remember the light first, a flat humming fluorescent above the security desk that made every reflection look thin and false. The agent slid a tablet toward me, the image on it grainy, a frame from a surveillance camera. I felt the metal edge of the boarding pass in my palm go suddenly too heavy to hold. Behind the plexiglass, someone was speaking, but for a moment their words were only a tide. The photograph steadied into sound, a suitcase, a watch glinting on a man's wrist, a pair of hands I knew as well as the pages I had cataloged for 30 years. "Ma'am," the agent said, and his voice was careful. "We need to ask you some questions about this man. His name is Richard Callaway." Before I could answer, before I could form any sensible refusal or laugh at the absurdity of being stopped in an airport, my name came into their mouths. Not in accusation exactly, but in a way that felt like the closing of a book. "You are listed here. You appear on these files." The tablet rotated, showed another still, the same suitcase, opened, paper envelopes, organized stacks, a slip of paper with an address I recognized because I had stamped it after a book donation years earlier. The watch flashed again, the same model Richard had started wearing within weeks of our meeting. Heavy, old-fashioned, the kind of object people prize not because of its price, but because of the stories they attach to it. I had not planned to get on a plane that day. I'd taken the ticket because sleep had become a harbor I could not find in my apartment. The idea of getting away, of walking among strangers where my name meant nothing, had been honest and cheap. Instead, I found myself in a fluorescent box, the sound of the security scanner receding as everything else tightened. A small voice behind the plexiglass asked the practical questions. Was I carrying anything for anyone? Had I communicated with Richard in the last 30 days? Do I consent to a brief interview? The formality of words tried to settle the room into a procedure, but my mouth tasted like the times my son had lied to me, and I had said nothing. That taste is metallic and familiar. It has the tang of pages thumbed too quickly. Before they led me away, the agent, Officer Martinez, folded his hands and said plainly, "We might have something here that connects your accounts to a larger scheme. We'd like you to come down to the station. Will you?" "I will" is what came out of me because my body had already stopped waiting to be asked. The fluorescent light above us hummed on, as if nothing had shifted, and yet everything had rearranged itself into a single intolerable axis. The man who had held my hand while I told him about my husband's funeral, my son who had come to me one night with a stack of overdue notices and the shame of a man with an empty wallet, and the ledger of names on that tablet, the ledger that had my handwriting on one of its pages. If this sounds like a cliffhanger, a clever hook you might have seen before, believe me, it felt like drowning. I understood the metaphor then, in that room, the way someone could drown by a slow, tactical erosion of trust rather than a sudden tidal wave. Betrayal, once it knows where to reach, slips beneath the surface and works quietly. Before I tell you how it happened, because it did not happen in a single instant at an airport, I need to ask something small of you. If this story matters to you, if it makes your pulse unsteady or your jaw clench, please stick with me to the end. If you have found something here that gives you a voice or a warning, subscribe so others can hear it. And if you can, share it with someone who sits alone with bills and a warm smile at the wrong time. I promise the story is worth the wait. It began at a table in a coffee shop where the light was kinder. I was 54 then, a librarian in a modest branch of the city system, small wrists forever ink-stained from the old habit of writing returning dates on paper slips. I had been alone for a few years. My husband, Thomas, had died quietly in his sleep. His death had been a closing chapter, a folded page. Jake, our son, lived 2 neighborhoods away and had his own complicated life. We were not the kind of family that kept secrets. We kept instead a kind of hopeful silence, the everyday arrangements of neighbors and relatives. The coffee shop had a wall of photographic prints, a hum of conversation, and the smell of espresso beans. I sat with a book spread on the table and the margin of my life running into someone else's in the ordinary way. An idle glance, a comment on the author, a mutual laugh at a battered paperback. He called himself Richard. He had a voice that could bend ordinary statements into something intimate. He knew the right pauses to make when I mentioned my husband, and he arrived at the table with a gift that felt like an old ritual, a copy of an out-of-print edition of a poetry collection I had once cataloged for the library. He said he had found it at an estate sale and thought of me. I did not notice the watch at first. It caught me later in the sunlight on his wrist when he reached for his cup. It was old and heavy and ironically precise, a small heirloom of taste. He told me a story about its origin, a man in Paris who sold watches to gentlemen. He told me about an office in a law firm where he had once done paperwork. He made a profession of being gentle with memory and with losses. It is disconcerting how quickly a person can make themselves necessary when they have learned to hold your grief as a form of skill. We began with small things. He read books I loved and bought me flowers, the way someone who has studied a life might choose accents for it. He offered to help with tasks I found awkward after my husband's death, dealing with a bulky boiler, fixing a broken screen on a cabinet. He knew which charity I had given to in Thomas's memory. He asked for nothing that seemed unusual. He got me to sign a power of attorney form once, to be helpful. He would manage a particular recurring payment, he said, because it was confusing in the way older systems could be. Think of it as administrative help, he told me. He leaned close. He spoke calmly. When I hesitated, he showed me the office where the document had been prepared. A sunlit room with shelves full of legal volumes. He wore that watch. Jake came to live with me briefly that winter. He had been laid off from a construction company, and the work he could find was irregular. He was ashamed to tell me how deep the late fees had become on his credit. He kept the envelopes folded tight in his pocket and tried to laugh about the weather. If you are the parent of an adult child you love, and love uncritically sometimes, you learn to make room for their embarrassment. I paid a few bills for him. I gave him small loans. I worried, but then rationalized the worry into chores and arguments, the domestic currency of small kindnesses. The first time I noticed something odd, I blamed myself. A check had cleared that should not have, or a transfer appeared on a bank statement with a memo I did not remember authorizing. The amounts were manageable at first, the accounting almost elegant. Small, regular sums that could be explained away as bank fees or subscription charges. When I called the bank, they were helpful and civil and spoke in procedural tones that made me feel ridiculous for calling at all. "Ma'am," the voice would say, "we have authorization on file." Authorization that I did not recall giving. The ledger of my life began to show ghost entries like someone practicing handwriting in the margins. I confronted Richard softly, the way one raises a photograph from a drawer. He smiled and said he had set things up because he wanted me protected. He said he had moved some accounts into different management to consolidate value and keep me from being taken advantage of. "You are too trusting," he told me, gently, as if I had asked to be corrected. His hands held mine, and his watch ticked. We had the intimacy of a pair who had learned each other's silences. When a second bank called to inform me of an odd transfer, I finally went in person to the branch. That day, the ledger showed me things that felt like a language I did not know. Trustees, custodial accounts, transfers flagged as estate planning. I sat with a bench of wood under my legs and thought of the stacks of old card catalogs in the library, each file a life organized. I felt like an index whose entries were being edited without my knowledge. By then, my son's debts were worse. Jake took on a job that had tasks he refused to describe fully and came home with a stiffness in his shoulders that had nothing to do with the weather. Once, in the corridor outside my bedroom, I overheard him on a call with someone who addressed him as Jake in a tone that bent polite brusqueness into something harsh. He hung up and said nothing, which was a way of communicating guilt without words. I wanted to ask him what was happening, but hit against his otherness, the small, shut door of humiliation many men close to their parents when they fail. The first real break in the pattern, the first point where a thread began to unravel, did not come from me. It came from a woman named Helen who lived in the next district and who had lost $5,000 to what she described as a fixer who seemed to take a personal interest in older people. Helen had read a small op-ed I wrote for the library newsletter about people who prey upon older patrons with assistance offers, and she came in one afternoon clutching photocopies and shaking in a way that made the world slow down. Her hands were like the hands in the airport photograph, marked by the work they had done and suddenly holding evidence. She spoke of a man with a watch. She spoke of meetings and lobbies, helpful forms that rearranged her bank accounts, a suitcase of documents that later vanished. When I heard her story, my head filled with the smell of old paper and the ticking of a watch I had seen in the sunlight. The coincidence tightened into suspicion. I called Officer Martinez then, though at first he was skeptical. The police are gatekeepers of scarce time, and fraud is often layered and deliberate. One claim is only a breadcrumb unless it can be shown to belong to a trail. He listened, made a note, but politely said the department needed more than a story and a memory to mobilize resources. "Bring us names," he said. "Bring us documents." I felt the ordinary, humiliating labor of being a victim, having to prove that you have been targeted. What accelerated things, what changed the pace from quiet fear to something urgent, was surveillance. There is no heroism in surveillance footage. It is a kind of bureaucratic truth, grainy images, fixed angles, the hum of a timestamp. It had been a warehouse manager, a man who kept records for storage units, who grew suspicious of a frequent renter, who seemed to move boxes labeled with the name of estates into a private truck. He did not know the moral weight of what he was filing when he sent the footage to a reporter friend. The reporter forwarded it to a detective. The detective forwarded it to Officer Martinez. A chain of small decisions like that is where many crimes begin to appear in the light. When Martinez called me to say they had a frame that might interest me, my stomach dropped. I went to the station and sat on folding chairs with my knees touching the cold of the linoleum. The interview room had a two-way mirror that changed the way you experienced presence. You could see what was inside but not know who watched from behind the glass. It is a literal symbol of what betrayal feels like, being observed, cataloged, judged, while someone else keeps the power of the gaze. The tablet showed me footage of a man at a warehouse, his wrist with the same heavy watch, a suitcase opened and unpacked in quick motions. He handled envelopes with an economy that suggested habit. The camera caught him near boxes stamped with the library's donation mark. One clip showed him slipping a small white envelope into a file, then closing and locking a cabinet. The footage was the kind of thing that takes the wind out of you. Nothing graphic, nothing cinematic, only the industriousness of a person doing things he had rehearsed. But the ledger on the table in plain handwriting matched several accounts that had been drained. My name appeared on a list, so did the names of Helen and two other women who had come forward. "Do you know him?" Martinez asked. "Yes," I said. My voice did not crack. It was a dry, efficient sound like paper sliding across a desk. But inside me, the sensation was different. It felt like a book whose spine had been broken and then glued back awkwardly. I knew the thin lines of his handwriting because he had once offered to help me label the boxes in the attic where Thomas's papers were kept. I had watched him write with a small, confident hand that could look like business or be practiced cruelty. Handwriting is intimacy. They asked me about Jake. I told them what I knew, the odd jobs, the phone calls, the stack of bills he hid in the back of his closet. They took my statements and then told me, in a measured way that did not attempt to console, that they had enough to present to a federal grand jury if more victims came forward. "This might be larger," Officer Martinez said. He used words like pattern, coordinated, possible conspiracy. The legal terminology was a scaffold I clung to because it offered a map. I had always loved maps. They brought me in again a week later, and this time the tablet showed documents. There were bank account numbers, titles, trust agreements, copies of identification. Among them was a photograph of a watch in an evidence bag, the same watch from the coffee shop, the watch from the warehouse. It sat in plastic and looked small and lonely. ADA Sarah Chen, who had the steady demeanor of someone who had studied too many human tragedies, explained that the watch itself was only 1 minute of a larger record. "We have witnesses," she said, "we have ledgers, we have surveillance that ties people together." Her voice was legal and warm at once, the professional kindness that says there is a fight worth taking on. "Is my son involved?" I asked, because the question was direct, and it allowed me to not say the thing I was most afraid of, that he had conspired with the man who had taken my trust and used it as a key. Sarah did not look surprised. She gave me the facts with care. Jake had been listed on a transfer as associate in certain records. There were phone records placing him at the warehouse at times that matched movement of boxes. They had an informant, someone who worked in the storage facility and had seen him helping load an item that was later found in a storage unit connected to Richard. The informant's name was redacted in documents that came with a solemnity I felt in my bones, the machinery of legal protection. "We can't make promises," the ADA said, "but we can tell you what we have and what we think." The sequence of events that followed felt like standing in the middle of a book whose pages had been scattered and then reordered by someone who read better than I did. There were subpoenas, there were warrants, there was a raid at dawn on a warehouse in the industrial part of town where the air tasted of oil and cardboard. I was not allowed to watch the raid. I sat in a small conference room with Helen and Carol and Margaret, women who had become allies not by choice, but by shared violation. And we cataloged the things we could remember. The pattern of approaches, the way the same smile had been used in different neighborhoods, the recurrent mention of help managing affairs. When the evidence arrived at the precinct, it was less dramatic than I had imagined. There were boxes of documents, labeled in someone's neat hand, envelopes with names, photos of bank statements. There were also small objects, jewelry, a watch, a suitcase with a library sticker on the inside lining. The items had the ordinariness of things that serve as props in a scam. Plausible, familiar, chosen precisely because they meant nothing controversial on the face of them. But lined up together, they looked like choreography. They looked, in short, deliberate. Jake was arrested later that month. The officers came to my apartment early and asked me to sit with tea while they explained he had been taken into custody. The way they said his name, without deliverance, felt like a sentence. I remember the softness of the mug in my hands and a book in the chair by the window that I could not bring myself to open, because words on a page seemed then to be betrayals too. They were sequences I could not control. When I visited him in the local lockup, the visiting room smelled of antiseptic and bad coffee. He wore a thin jacket and blinked like a man who had not slept. The plexiglass between us made his face a small object I could almost reach but not touch. He placed his hand on the glass as if testing whether connection could exist through polymer and air. The sound in my ear was the muffled cavity of the room. "Mom," he said. And the name was small and immediate. There was no pretense now, only the rawness of consequences. He was not defensive in the way I expected. He was embarrassed in a way more corrosive, the shame of having let need make him cruel. He started, and the word fractured into fragments, pressure, threats, promises. He spoke of a man who had known how to stroke a wound and then press it open to extract profit. Jake's voice was not a plea for mercy so much as a confession along a ledger line. He said things that made me want to fold up into the smallness of a book and hide. He told me he had helped because he felt cornered. He told me later that he had acted out of desperation, that debts had pressed on him until the world looked like a single urgent line: money or collapse. The prosecution offered him a cooperation agreement. He agreed to talk, at first because his lawyers told him it would offer him a chance of a reduced sentence, and later because he began to feel the burden of what he had done as something heavier than the possibility of prison. He gave interviews, he placed names, he led investigators to storage units. He admitted to moving files and occasionally stuffing envelopes. He said he had not planned deaths, had not killed anyone, had not wanted what had happened after the arrests. He regretted his choices in a tone that felt like a man learning to carry his own weight. That is the nuance I want you to carry with you when I say his name in this story. Jake was both an antagonist and a broken mirror. He was driven to desperation by circumstances, by a labor market that had no gentle middle road for men who had aged out of certain trades, by shame that makes small lies feel necessary. He was not excused, he could not be, but he was not simply monstrous either. He was human and culpable and ultimately part of the path to justice because his cooperation helped the investigators map a network of predatory relationships. Yet even cooperation does not undo harm. The legal machinery moves in slabs: indictment, arraignment, plea bargaining, grand jury investigations. It does not repair the intimate erosion of trust. It creates paper and precedent and sometimes the quiet of convictions. There were moments when the law felt like a balm, when the judge signed warrants, when evidence was logged and placed under seal, when the feds announced charges that read like a ledger after a final edit. There were other moments when the law felt like a lens that stripped the world down into terms I had to learn: conspiracy to commit financial exploitation, money laundering, wire fraud. These terms felt both precise and inadequate to describe the shape of what had happened in my life. Walking into the courtroom in the early morning, I felt as if I had returned to the library in a different role, not a quiet cataloger, but a witness to an organization's failures. The courtroom's light was dry, the hardwood was polished. Plexiglass in the gallery recalled the same barrier I had seen in the jail visiting room. The defendant sat with his watch, smaller now because it was only one object on a table of evidence. Richard's face held the practiced ease of someone who had learned to wear a mask for the public. There were moments in his expressions that suggested impatience rather than malice, and I found that more chilling than grotesque rage. Evil in these cases is often not theatrical, it is administrative. The prosecutor, ADA Sarah Chen, called me in the third week of testimony. Her questions were direct and kind, a legal kindness shaped by experience. "Did you ever sign anything that transferred assets without your consent?" she asked. "Did you see these documents before?" She asked me to read aloud the notes I had taken when I first suspected something. Reading those pages felt like reading someone else's marginalia in a book I loved. They were both mine and alien. The jury's faces were functional, notebook hands poised. The judge watched with the economy of someone accustomed to calibrating human lives against statutes. The defense tried to paint my memory as faulty, my judgment as impaired by grief. They raised the question of whether I had allowed access, whether I had, in a moment of loneliness, made decisions that opened the door. They asked about my son, about family dynamics, about the muddy border between help and manipulation. Cross-examination can be a surgical thing. It pares and probes and leaves the witness raw. I felt the thinness of my own missteps like pages turned too fast. Still, evidence is stubborn. The photographs from the warehouse, the ledgers, the recorded phone calls between co-conspirators, the watch in the evidence bag, the storage receipts with my library stamp, these things pressed an incontrovertible pattern. The jury saw the connections the way a reader sees the architecture of a plot. They heard Jake's collaboration and his remorse. They heard Helen and Carol and Margaret tell their stories in measured voices that bore the weight of small humiliations. They saw a pattern of grooming, of charm used as currency, of documents that turned trust into ledger entries. When the verdict came, I sat with my hands folded like a woman holding a heavy, beloved book. The jury's foreperson read in a voice that felt both ordinary and immense. Guilty on most counts. The courtroom made small sounds, like pages turning, and then the judge's gavel came down with the sound I had heard 1,000 times in small affairs when I stamped returns at the library. It was decisive and not restorative. It did not bring back what had been taken. It did, however, make a public accounting. The aftermath did not feel like an ending. Conviction meant sentences, and sentences meant papers and appeals, and later, inmates in custody. There were deaths in the periphery, one that was reported as a suicide in custody, and another that the family complained was neglect, each mentioned in clipped news pieces and folded into a ledger of systemic failure. I do not dwell on those details here, beyond noting that the criminal network's reach had consequences beyond the money it extracted. Human beings unravel in many ways, and systems designed to hold them can sometimes be indifferent. Out of that unraveling came a new life for me. Once the jury had spoken, once the slow machinery of justice had done what it could do, I found that anger could be turned into work. I began to meet other survivors in rooms warmed by tea and the possibility of shared tactic. We created a small, informal coalition at first, Helen, Carol, Margaret, and I, women who had survived manipulative relationships that used kindness as an instrument of theft. We met in the back room of the little community center where I had given readings, the smell of boiled coffee and the quiet of folding chairs setting a modest stage. We invited Officer Martinez and ADA Sarah Chen to speak to groups. People came who had been embarrassed to speak up, caretakers, adult children, neighbors. We published a small guide on warning signs, rapid insistence on handling accounts, insistence on secrecy, sudden offers to manage investments, frequent references to trusted professionals who are never fully identified. We reminded people, gently, with the tone of librarians, to photocopy documents, to insist on independent counsel, to trust their own sense of strange when it appears. We organized workshops in senior centers. We built a hotline in partnership with a local nonprofit. We used books as symbols, the library as a place not merely of quiet reading, but of resources and defense. Jake, who had pleaded guilty to a lesser count in exchange for his cooperation, entered a program that combined counseling and vocational training. He spoke at one small conference we organized, and his voice trembled as he described shame and the way need can warp judgment. He did not ask for forgiveness in any grandiose way. He asked only to do better. He began to volunteer with a job placement initiative for older workers, and I watched him rebuild a life in small, patient increments. He did not repair everything he had broken, but his cooperation had helped expose a network that might have continued preying on others. That is a strange kind of redemption, partial, practical, not theatrical. Richard and several of his alleged co-conspirators were sentenced. Their sentences varied. The law does what it can within the architecture of plea deals and evidentiary margins. The watch landed in evidence drawers, the suitcase was cataloged and became an exhibit in a case file whose edges we learned to accept. The warehouse's owner testified that he had been duped into renting space under false pretenses. Martindale, a figure who had once advised on wills and who appears in the press under a neutral tone, was eventually charged with enabling transactions, his professional credibility used as a veneer for ethical rot. He was convicted on counts related to improper fiduciary conduct. The network was not a single villain, but a constellation of people with professional authority who misapplied it. I tell you these things not to provide a linear legal textbook, but because the shape of this harm matters. Predatory networks are built on routine, trust, impatience, the language of scarcity. They function in daylight with a formality that shields them. What made ours different was that the ledger became public and we responded in chorus. The coalition we built grew into a conference that we organized 6 months after the trials concluded. We filled a ballroom with folding chairs and a podium, and survivors told their stories into microphones with the calm force of people determined to be useful to others. We had a table with resources, legal referrals, and the small printed brochure we had made about signs and steps. At the conference, I spoke last. I did not rehearse the moment into eloquence. I spoke as I had lived, one sentence at a time, each sentence staking a claim to the truth. I told the room about the watch and the suitcase and the photograph that had stopped me in the airport. I told them about the plexiglass in the jail, about the sound of the gavel, about Jake pressing his palm to the glass. I spoke about how shame had visited us and how we had answered with names and copies and witness. Around me were women who had been quiet for too long and who now held their small self-defense books like badges of honor. We turned our attention then to prevention in the public square. We worked with legal clinics to provide pro bono counsel. We pushed for clearer practices around estate planning and for mandatory fiduciary training for professionals who manage elderly clients' affairs. We advocated for better reporting mechanisms in banks for unusual transfers and for clearer safeguards when a power of attorney is requested. We were careful not to promise that our work would make anyone invulnerable. Instead, we offered tools, insistence on independent attorneys, multiple signatories on large transactions, the simple insistence that a document be read and explained in plain terms before signature. It would be dishonest to say that these measures healed the wound. They did not. What they did was create a map for others, and for me, they replaced the helplessness with something more serviceable: purpose. I found myself at the podium more often, reading from notes I had once used to catalog donations, but now used to name a pattern. I felt myself reclaiming the identity of a woman who could be careful with words and with warning, who could take the experience of being targeted and craft it into a defense for others. Around me were women who had been quiet for too long and who now held their small self-defense books like badges of honor. We turned our attention then to prevention in the public square. We worked with legal clinics to provide pro bono counsel. We pushed for clearer practices around estate planning and for mandatory fiduciary training for professionals who manage elderly clients' affairs. We advocated for better reporting mechanisms in banks for unusual transfers and for clearer safeguards when a power of attorney is requested. We were careful not to promise that our work would make anyone invulnerable. Instead, we offered tools, insistence on independent attorneys, multiple signatories on large transactions, the simple insistence that a document be read and explained in plain terms before signature. It would be dishonest to say that these measures healed the wound. They did not. What they did was create a map for others, and for me, they replaced the helplessness with something more serviceable: purpose. I found myself at the podium more often, reading from notes I had once used to catalog donations, but now used to name a pattern. I felt myself reclaiming the identity of a woman who could be careful with words and with warning, who could take the experience of being targeted and craft it into a defense for others. There are details I still carry that I cannot unpack entirely. The photograph on the tablet at the airport, when I look back, feels like a seam in a dress that has been cut away to reveal stitching. I see now the places where decisions were sewn. The watch appears in my memory often, on Richard's wrist in sunlight, in the evidence bag under the fluorescent hum, on a table in the courtroom that seemed too ordinary for the life it had helped to arrange. The suitcase with its library sticker reminds me of how ordinary objects can be turned into keys. Books, too, They were both the bait and the anchor in my story. I gave away some volumes in the months after the trial. I kept others as talismans of identity. Even now, there are nights when I wake with the precise memory of the plexiglass, the way it made distance a substance, and I think about what it means to be both observed and unable to act. I think about the small things that changed everything, the way a man learned to love my sadness and then weaponized it, the way a son's desperation pushed him into compromise, the way a warehouse manager's instinct to report a strange renter changed our lives. I think about the practicalities, copies, witness statements, affidavits, the slow hand of the law. And I think, always, about the conference room where we first decided to turn our anger outward toward prevention. There is more I want to show you: the slow choreography of the investigation, the testimony that felt like language class for the guilty, the tiny human exchanges in visiting rooms and in the lobby with the ADA. There are also the things we did afterward: workshops in suffrage halls, the hotline we built, the small legal changes that took root because people became brave enough to tell their stories. But before I go on, I want to underline this. If you know someone, a parent, a neighbor, a friend, who has become suddenly dependent on help from a new acquaintance, if you find surprise signatures on your documents, if you see things like frequent small withdrawals with vague memos, pause. Do not shame the person. Do not assume malice. Ask for copies. Encourage independent legal counsel. Protect documentation. Small administrative defenses can be the scaffolding that keeps trust from being harvested. The airport photograph is where the legal narrative picked up speed, but it is not where the emotional journey ended. The courtroom verdict was not a cure for the ways trust changes after betrayal. And yet it was the hinge that let me swing from a private damaged life into a public life of advocacy. It is a life made of phone calls and flyers and the smell of brewed coffee at community centers. It is a life in which I sleep with the light on sometimes and wake to write lists of names and resources to hand out. The airport photograph is where the legal narrative picked up speed, but it is not where the emotional journey ended. The courtroom verdict was not a cure for the ways trust changes after betrayal. And yet it was the hinge that let me swing from a private damaged life into a public life of advocacy. It is a life made of phone calls and flyers and the smell of brewed coffee at community centers. It is a life in which I sleep with the light on sometimes and wake to write lists of names and resources to hand out. When I stood in front of the camera at the small conference we hosted and said the words that became the first page of our guide, I felt something like the relief one feels after returning a book you thought you had lost. The work of cataloging other people's harms brought me back to the work I loved, organizing knowledge so that others could find it. We learned to treat documents like the fragile testimonies they are, not as tools for voyeurism, but as instruments for defense. There are chapters left to this story: the sentencing hearings that unveiled quieter accomplices, the policy meetings that tasted like bureaucracy and small victory, the individual counseling sessions where survivors recounted the shame that had silenced them. There are personal reckonings too: dinners with Jake where we speak of money and trust and what it means to start over, letters from Helen asking how to cope with a fear that resurfaces when a new man offers help. There are small practical victories, like when a local bank updated its protocol concerning powers of attorney after our advocacy, or when a social worker used our brochure to intervene with a worried neighbor. And there are still questions that keep me awake. How many more networks exist just out of sight? How many professional veneers hide predation? How many people still believe charm is the measure of character? I cannot answer them all, but I can point to what helped us: documentation, community, legal pressure, and the willingness of a few to call what they saw by its name. I will tell you about the verdicts and sentencing and some of the policy wins next, and I will tell you about the night I returned to that airport months later to testify in a civil hearing and to see the same unit clerk who had handed me the tablet. I will tell you about the conference in which, unexpectedly, Jake and I sat on a panel together and read from the same modest pamphlet we had once handed out with trembling hands. I will tell you about small moments of restitution that are not financial rewards, but the slow rebuilding of community trust. For now, know this. The photograph in the airport did not merely stop me from boarding a plane. It stopped the quiet anonymity of a pattern that had been allowed to persist. It turned private shame into public testimony, and it forced me to choose between the silence that comes from fear and the noise that might protect someone else. I chose noise. There is more to say about courtroom days that test a body's toughness, about the way investigators piece together phone records, about the warehouse's inventory that read like an obscene anthology of other people's lives, and I will tell you those things because they are useful. But before I move into the next sequence, I want to be clear. This is not only my story. It is the story of a constellation of everyday people who woke up and began to speak. It is the story of how attention, when collected and held steadily, can change outcomes. When the federal agents finally announced the full indictment and the names of the defendants, the press line outside the courthouse had that bland, hungry interest of media. I remember the hollow sound of a microphone being adjusted, and then the clarity of Ada Sarah Chen's voice as she read the charges. Conspiracy to commit financial exploitation, money laundering, wire fraud, and aiding and abetting. The list was juridical and near biblical in its dryness. The more human proofs came in court: bank statements, the watch, the suitcase, the names in a ledger, the recorded calls between the ringleaders and their associates. Each piece of evidence was small. Each piece pointed to a pattern. There were nights after long hearings when I would walk home with the cold city under my coat and hold a paperback in my hand for comfort. The weight of a book on the subway is different from the weight of guilt. The first can steady you, the second can sink you. In public, I learned to speak with crisp sentences. In private, I learned to say nothing at all for hours. I will not pretend the next part of my life was easy. It was simply different. I learned to transform the pattern recognition of a librarian's craft into the advocacy of a survivor. I mapped names and dates and then mapped the people who could intervene. I spoke at elder care training sessions and at finance seminars. I testified at hearings that pushed for stronger fiduciary oversight. And sometimes, in small, quiet ways, I found myself offering a hand to someone I would once have called a stranger. If you have found your way here, hearing this story, know one last small practical thing for this segment. Keep copies. Keep photocopies of any document that seems to grant unusual authority over finances. Ask for independent counsel before signing estate documents. Keep a record of phone calls and names. And if you feel alone, look for coalition. Other people hold pieces of the truth you cannot yet see. There is more still: how the jury reacted to a particular witness, what the sentencing judge chose as a term for Richard and his associates, how I organized the first small symposium on predatory relationships, and the way Jake's volunteer work began to look like repair. Those are the scenes that follow the legal scaffolding and lead us into the heart of resilience, and I will take you there next. The witness who did the most damage to their defense was not an expert, not a banker, not even one of the investigators. She was a small woman with yellowed skin and a voice that trembled like old glass. Her name was Rosa, and she had spent 30 years folding shirts in a dry cleaning shop 2 blocks from the senior complex. She had no inkling when she accepted a cup of coffee from a brisk man named Lewis that the smile he gave her that winter morning would later appear, printed and laminated, beside a stack of forged wills. On the stand, Rosa did what ordinary witnesses do. She told the truth in the shape she knew it. She described a man coming in who liked the radio too loud and who always paid in cash. She described a scarf that someone left behind and the way an envelope with neat handwriting had been shoved under the counter. She described, finally, a photograph in that envelope, a husband's face, sunburnt and laughing, tucked inside a note that read, "For when you miss him." She had kept the photograph, she said, because it was all she had ever been given for kindness, and because it reminded her of her own husband dead these many years. When the photograph was brought into evidence, when the prosecutor held it up under the court's bright lights, a hush fell like snowfall. Jurors leaned forward in their seats as if proximity would increase comprehension. One older woman on the panel touched her temples as if to steady the thought of how easily trust could be traded. A man in a suit at the back of the courtroom, one of the defendant's friends perhaps, covered his mouth with his hand until his fingers were white. It is a small thing, the photograph, but the sight of it on the stand made clear how the inventory in that warehouse was less an accounting ledger than a catalog of absent lives. Sarah Chen's closing was plain and unlit by rhetoric. She did not need ornament, for the evidence had already rendered the portrait. She spoke about pattern, a sequence of small deceptions that had been allowed to accumulate. She spoke about consent, stolen not in a single dramatic moment, but in a long series of papers signed in tired rooms, in phone calls made in the name of convenience, in the slow erosion of autonomy. The jury listened. When the verdict came, guilty on most counts, the sound it made in the courtroom was not triumphal. It was the particular quiet of things finally named. Sentencing, as sentences do, translated naming into measure. The judge spoke of aggravating factors and of the calculated nature of the scheme. Richard and his closest associates received terms that would see them out of most members' lives for years. Others who had cooperated received reduced sentences and were required to participate in restitution efforts. The civil claims that followed produced settlements that paid some bills and bought some time, but the larger compensation was intangible. Lawyers forced to acknowledge missteps, institutions compelled to revise policies, and a cadre of professionals who could no longer say they had not seen the signs. There were courthouse rituals that still rankled, legal filings into which grief had to be distilled, depositions in which the words capacity and consent were thrown about like blunt instruments. There were, too, moments of odd repair. A box of personal effects recovered from the warehouse included a battered wristwatch engraved with a child's handwriting. It had been cataloged in the inventory as misc jewelry until an investigator recognized the engraving. I stood beside an elderly man whose hands trembled less from age than from the long unfolding of shame. He took the watch, and in the middle of the evidence room, he wept, not from the novelty of a reclaimed object, but from the restoration of a small continuity in his life. That watch did not make him whole. It, however, made him seen. The symposium we organized was modest in scale and stubborn in purpose. We rented a public room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs. We printed a pamphlet the size of a paperback and stapled copies into neat piles. The audience was not composed of those who enjoy the sound of their own certainty, but of people who had been wearing the same anxious question for years: how to protect elders without infantilizing them, how to balance kindness with caution. Social workers, estate attorneys, clergy, bank tellers, family members, each came with an expertise and a doubt. Jake and I sat on the same panel. We read from the same pamphlet we had once handed out in trembling hands. There were practical items on those pages. Keep copies of power of attorney documents. Demand independent legal counsel. Know the signatures on checks. Notice when a familiar pattern of giving changes into a secrecy of transactions. But there were also items about posture. How to ask questions that respect dignity. How to step back when independence is the wish. How to hold someone's hand and their paperwork with equal care. The most attended session was not the legal one. It was the round table on reparation, a messy, human discussion about what it means to rebuild trust after consent has been violated. Jake's volunteer work began as a quiet response and turned slowly into daily repair. He taught a class at the senior center on recognizing red flags. He sat with people while they sorted mail and explained why a power of attorney should not be signed after midnight. He learned the names of folks who came in with no family and made sure they had someone to call when they needed a ride. People who had once crossed the street to avoid interaction now waved him down to ask a question about a phone bill or to borrow a pen. The work was not heroic. It was stubborn, repetitive, and in the end, more potent. There were evenings, meaningless on their surface, that felt like the small ledger of recovery. A neighbor returned the photograph Rosa had kept, now cleaned and framed. A bank instituted a flagging system for large transfers from accounts whose owners had recently changed representation. A volunteer group set up a buddy system to sit with people during calls from strangers. These were not swift miracles. They were the slow accretion of attention, a tightening of nets where once there had been holes. I learned in those months that the kind of resilience that matters is not the one that converts pain into a tidy lesson. It is the kind that shows up and sits in the waiting room, the kind that keeps photocopies in a drawer and knows whom to call. There is no single moment that undoes the damage inflicted by those who trafficked in trust. There are only accumulative acts, photographs returned, ledgers read aloud, legal language made plain, each one a small reclamation. Standing after the symposium, watching people cluster in conversations about training schedules and community outreach, I felt the work of those months fold into something broader. The courtroom had delivered a decision. The community was beginning to bend its habits. The warehouse's inventory would be cataloged and archived, names would be cross-checked, policies would change. And somewhere between the legal scaffolding and the daily acts of neighborliness, a different way of attending to each other was forming, slow and relentless as tide. This is how repair begins, with the ordinary insistence of people who will not let a photograph be only evidence, who will not let a ledger be only numbers. It begins with the choice to notice, to record, to speak, and then to stay.